Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading. Then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Chris Rexroad, and we're looking at a passage from Mark chapter 6. I want to talk today about the times when it's tough to believe in Jesus' words and his works. So Mark presents this series of events that occur within a very short period of time, and these events give us a picture of Jesus under some incredible stress. We find him rejected by his own hometown. He can only reach that surrounding area by sending his disciples out as his representatives to preach and teach the gospel, to heal the sick, cast out devils. It was about this time that Jesus learns that his first cousin, John the Baptist, was beheaded in prison. And the events that led up to John's execution are details of grotesque sin, adultery, sexual lust, malicious hatred. And Jesus attempts to take a break from ministry, surely to process the news of John's death. But the crowds invade his personal space, and he winds up not only teaching them, but performing a miracle with bread and fish so people can have a meal. The very night following the miracle, Jesus walks on water in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, where he rescues his disciples from a terrible storm by calming the storm with a command. And when he arrives on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, there is yet another crowd waiting for him. Again, he ministers in what is surely this state of exhaustion. Everywhere he went, in cities and villages in the countryside, he's thronged by people. And he always heals the people and teaches them. And in some cases, there are so many people that he is only able to walk past them so that they might touch his clothes and receive a miracle. Once more, we witness extreme reactions to Jesus' ministry. He's rejected by some. He's crowded by other people who demand a healing, this miracle, or a meal. And he's pressed by some, pushed by others, and pursued constantly. But there are three key reactions from this text that I want to point to. First, Nazareth rejected him because they are too familiar with him. The people in Jesus' hometown rejected him because they had watched him grow up. They had seen him as a child. They knew his family. You see that in verse 3. Once again, we see an implication that Jesus lived as a humble, ordinary boy growing up into a young man before he was revealed as the Messiah. They simply refused to believe. People often fail to see God's work in ordinary people. Jesus was certainly not ordinary, but the people of Nazareth perceived him to be ordinary because they were familiar with him and his family. Jesus is at work in ordinary people. God can minister through your spouse, through your parents, through your children, co-workers, next-door neighbors, and other everyday people. All of them can be used by God to affect your life. And many of the people, though, would reject his message, even as it was delivered through his disciples. When Jesus sent his disciples out, he instructed them to shake the dust from their feet if a household refused to receive their message about Jesus. Shaking off the dust from the feet was a cultural action that indicated a person was no longer going to interact with another person. It was an action similar to our concept of a breakup in a relationship, or a rescinding of a contract, or walking out of someone's life for good. The message of Jesus can cause others to walk away from us. The message of Jesus can also bring relationships to a critical point where we have to walk away from other people. Not everyone will receive the message of Christ. His disciples failed to comprehend the miracle of the loaves and the fish because their hearts were too hard. Even though the disciples were the closest people to Jesus and were right in the middle of the busyness of ministry, they too failed to understand the depth and meaning of what Jesus was doing. After Jesus performed the miracle of the loaves and the fish and then walked on water and calmed a storm, the scripture states that his disciples had not comprehended the meaning of his actions. Their hearts were still too hard to take it in. The disciples did not fail to understand because they did not believe in Jesus. They did. The text indicates that they failed to understand because Jesus was acting in ways and methods that they could not comprehend. When Jesus came walking on the water, the disciples thought they were seeing a ghost. That language indicates that they mistook Jesus for a demonic spirit. God often moves in unconventional and incomprehensible ways. It is critical for us to be able to discern the work of God when his methods go against your own expectations. So, Chris, let's look at a couple of things. what do we do with Jesus? Like when he speaks through someone that you know or someone that you see every day, how do we respond to that?
I think the first thing, depending on the level that we know that person's depth with Christ and their intentions, if we know that they're a strong Christian and that they have good intentions for you, is really to lean into it. And I think with any message that you receive from somebody that you know or you don't know, you always want to test it. You want to find out, is this actually something that Jesus was calling me to do? If it's an obvious, then you respond to it. If it's not obvious, my advice would be to pray on it and follow up on it.
We can become so familiar with people. The place I think it is the most obvious is with a spouse. We see them every day. We know them every day. We know they're good, they're bad, and hearing what they have to say sometimes as spiritual, as guidance from the Lord can be difficult, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you, if you know so much, why don't you figure a couple of things out on your own instead of telling me I need to figure them out, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we even find that, I believe, to be true in churches. It is why the tenure of most pastors is so low.
Mm-hmm.
It's still today under 3 years, even with long-term pastorates, and what that tells me, so like for me, I've been the pastor here for 14 years. And I know quite a few other long-term pastors. So if the average is still below 3 years, there's got to be a lot that are 6 to 12 months, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the reason why that happens is because we're uncomfortable with that person telling us spiritual things. I tell people frequently the reason that number is so low. I used to hear people say, well, they get to know him and they know he's not perfect. And so they want somebody that they can at least fool themselves and believe in.
They're out of the honeymoon phase.
Right. I also believe it is he knows they're not perfect. And he learns them, and then he begins to speak to some specific things that are addressed in that congregation, in that culture, in that town, in that place. And that makes them just as uncomfortable as not knowing he's not perfect, right? And so we struggle to receive from people that we see and know every day. Can you think of some times when maybe Jesus spoke through some people you didn't expect him to speak through?
Yeah. Before I was even considering going into ministry, but I was heavily involved with the church that I was at the time, there was a coworker of mine and I can't remember his name right now, but I know that he was active in ministry and he was working there and doing ministry part-time. And he really challenged me on actually applying the Bible, not just going to church and learning about it, but actually starting to apply it and start making disciples. And that's when he started talking to me about the concept of that we're supposed to be disciple makers. So that was pretty unique for me, especially since it was I was a machinist at the time. So having that happen on the factory floor, it took me back a little bit and it made me reevaluate things. But yeah. And then another one when I was on a missions trip before I went into ministry on an island in St. Vincent. He's still a good friend of mine. His name's Auction. And we sat down and had conversations while we were on breaks from the work that we were doing. And he was there studying to become a minister to go back to Haiti. And we had some really deep conversations that, you go on a mission trip and you're like, okay, I'm going here to help these people and all this and that. And then you sit down and have a conversation with somebody and they start asking you questions about, his question that always stuck in my head is, he said, well, why is it that on your money it says in God we trust, but your country doesn't do that? Which is a fair question, and it kind of took me back and we had some deep conversations. And just hearing the dedication in his life and his family and where he come from, just it was humbling. It made me think on those things a lot more.
Yeah, I've had some moments where people unexpectedly said things that I knew were clearly from God, directly for me. I can think of times where the person didn't realize they were speaking to me, so it may have been in a large room, but I knew that God was using what they were saying. There've been some other times where the person was speaking directly to me, but I don't think they even realized the impact that it had on me and what they were saying. And I think we have to be aware that sometimes God uses people that we don't expect at times to share things with us, and we have to be aware of when God can speak at any time through anything, right? And can you think of any times when Jesus, the Holy Spirit, God moved in ways and it made you uncomfortable?
Being called into ministry. I didn't come from a family that anybody was in ministry. Because if anybody was in my line, I wouldn't have existed because it was Catholicism.
Right.
So if my dad was a priest, I wouldn't be here. But no, I didn't come from that background, so it was very unusual to me. So going into that, it was a complete change of everything. The style of work, the location of work, and just the concept of going into it was a big mindset change for me because I didn't have anything to relate it to, but I knew that he was calling me into it. So it was probably about 4 years of uncomfortableness, just because of not knowing.
I can think about a church service I was in that I was extremely uncomfortable in. But there were some specific things that happened that night that were very enlightening to me. And I walked away never having forgotten them. I'm like, out of all the church services I've ever been to, there are probably 20 that I would reference about something specific happening, that I recall. And that would be one of those top 20. Not any, it was just a few things that took place that I watched take place that most any other environment I would have been extremely uncomfortable about, but was appreciative with the way they dealt with it, what they said, and how God had worked in that moment. And so, I was uncomfortable, but God was still teaching me things even in my discomfort. So
I think another one that was more situational, not just changing in life, is the last church I was at. They hadn't really ever done any kind of missions work, like where they actually go and do it. And so I was trying to start those things up. And the one, I have a connection in Haiti that we actually support right now is, and I was in contact with him, and I met him from that conversation I had on St. Vincent. He was there too, training as a minister. And we ended up connecting, and I said, hey, what do you think about me coming down there and seeing what we can do to help you guys out? And this is before all the turmoil that's been going on now, but it wasn't too far off from that. And I went down there by myself to meet with him and another gentleman that were both from Haiti. So I know that I was dealing with locals. But once I got there, the first 2 or 3 days, especially the first day, was very uncomfortable. I was glad to be with them, but I knew that I was in environments that I could disappear. That, I being white, I was probably the only one that I saw in town going through, except for one person in a store. And there was a lot of places that we rolled through where he had his windows tinted, and I was sitting in the back, and he said, "Don't roll your window down unless I let you know it's safe."
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and then you're in another country where you know that you can't just like run to the police department if there's a problem or something, because I was actually up in the mountains with him. But after the third day, I realized that we were very safe up there. But the first 2 days, Jenny even said, she goes, "I heard something in your voice I'd never heard before."
God speaks to us through some unusual situations.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Mark.